My name is Rolf Rosenkrantz and I'm here at the European Development Days in Brussels. And with me I have Maarten van Aaslt, the director of the Red Cross Red Crescent's Climate Center. Did I get that correctly?
That's right.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being with us.
Pleasure.
So Maarten, tell me, what do you see as some of the major challenges in humanitarian aid delivery today?
Well, one of the challenges I see is that we still face a funding gap before disasters. So you see it right now with the Philippines, for instance. The floodgates of financing open after something terrible hits the front pages of the newspapers. And of course that's important. We want to be able to provide the best possible response. But over the past decades we've realized that more and more our work is needed actually beforehand to reduce risks before a disaster strikes. And that's increasingly the case with changing climate risks. So try and anticipate disasters better, use scientific information on the ground to feed our decisions, but also get the financing to invest is still a major challenge.
And when we look at, for instance, Somalia, there was a huge drought and a food crisis a couple of years ago, and it still reverberates today. At the time, we had that information already. Something was coming up. Obviously, it's no surprise to have a drought in that part of the world. Why do you think things didn't happen quite as we would have wanted them to happen?
Well, I think Somalia is a particularly difficult case. This is one where development is not happening as we would want it to happen in general. But even beyond Somalia, I think in cases like this, there is a gap between what we can do with humanitarian financing after a disaster and what we can do for long-term development before a disaster. And somehow, even if we have indications of highly elevated levels of risk, we're unable to mobilize additional resources when the crisis is building up. And this is true for droughts in particular areas of the world, but it's also true for heavy flood seasons. When we see an El Niño coming, in the Red Cross Red Crescent, we already know where around the world we may be facing more disasters. But as long as it's not entirely clear where and when, how big a disaster is going to occur, it's very difficult to release the financing beforehand. Even though in some cases, we've seen this in West Africa, where we pre-position stocks and work with local communities, we're able to achieve a much faster time to reach the average beneficiary, actually save many more livelihoods than we would otherwise have had, but at the same time reduce the cost per beneficiary by about 30%. So it's also about development effectiveness that we need to change these financing streams.
So there are more early warning systems that I think have been put into place, and more local food storage places, however you want to call these things, in the Sahel, in the Horn of Africa, elsewhere around the world. What other innovations do you think we need to adopt more forcefully in order to make a difference?
Well, the main thing is we're facing a changing climate, and we're facing rapidly changing risks around the world, not just due to climate change, but also due to urbanization and local environmental degradation. And most of our risk assessments are still snapshots. So we take one snapshot of risk right now, and that's what we start managing. Whereas we want people taking decisions themselves to understand what risk they're facing and how those risks are changing. So a lot of the innovations that we work on are actually on those dialogues. And it's in tools like animations, it's in tools like games. And then taking the very best novelist science to the local level and actually coupling it directly to decisions, including financing.
Over the last couple of years, we've seen a lot of awareness about climate change, and we've seen some more money going towards those causes. The GEF, for instance, there's a whole bunch of financing mechanisms, and the UNEP, for instance, the environmental program, has gotten more powers to take charge of some of these challenges. But where do you see the challenges going forward and some of those solutions? I mean, are we really on the right path, or is this just more talk? Is it rearranging the deck chairs rather than really making an effort, making an impact?
Well, the problem is bigger than the solutions that we have on our hands today. So I think the past 10 years have seen very encouraging progress. There is much more financing for adaptation available, and that adaptation is applied more aligned with development planning, which I think is the key. It's not a new sector, it's something that needs to be done as part of development and part of humanitarian response, rather than on its own. That said, the resources that we would need are of the scale, well, the World Bank calculated about 100 billion a year. We're nowhere near that. And to the extent we're getting it, it's often relabeled development financing. So in that sense, we face a big gap.
what are some of the opportunities that you see for companies, but also maybe NGOs, to create a market, create a business almost in that space, climate change adaptation?
Well, clearly, if governments are starting to invest more, and multilateral development banks, for instance, are increasing their investments there, they don't want that just to stick in national infrastructure projects. More and more of that needs to go down to the local level. And that's often where the entrepreneurial ideas come up, where people can do smart things with new crops, or with small-scale irrigation systems, or getting the information to the right place at the right time to be smarter in agriculture investments, sometimes coupled with small-scale insurance. There's all kinds of things happening, primarily at those more local scales, that could also be interesting for businesses, but certainly are already happening in the NGO sphere.
Can you pinpoint certain types of jobs, certain types of innovations, or maybe some regions where we'll see much more activity in the future? And if I was the leader of one of those organizations, I would need to look towards those.
You mean as a private business organization?
Yeah.
Well, I think a lot of the bigger risk assessment business at this point is in the bigger infrastructure. So it's coastal protection, it's hydropower plants, it's design of major infrastructure projects like highways. I think that's a market that's in a way already acknowledged and explored. I think the finer texture of the more local risk management is where some of the most interesting opportunities should lie. And there's an inevitable growth market, possibly the most so in the countries where the needs are highest. Now, those are also the places where the markets are least developed. So I'm sure that's a problem for private sector entities, but still, I think they should be taking that opportunity right now, because it's bound to grow over the coming years, because we're already seeing the risks rising locally. So there is an appetite there, and the global financing is increasing.
And what sort of jobs do you think will increase in the aid community because of these changing realities and increased focus on climate change? What kind of people do we need more of, you think, in the coming years?
Well, there is already a growth in climate science, and what we basically need is more development practitioners doing what they would already have done without climate change, but now using that new information. So what we need is bridge builders, people that can do both. For instance, one of the things that people had never imagined 10 years ago is that one of our primary academic partners for the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center is the Parsons School for Design in New York City. They're part of the New School. And they're design students that go out into the world working with the Red Cross to design games to facilitate dialogues between scientists and practitioners. Those sorts of innovative sectors, I think, are the places where we need to find the new energy to keep this agenda moving.
And where do you see your center going? What is next up for you on your agenda?
Well, certainly this area of dialogues is key to us. And it's dialogues between science and practice, between science and policy and practice. So for instance, last week in Warsaw, the climate negotiations, we hosted the Development and Climate Days, which really brought together the scientists, the local practitioners facing the risks day to day, and the negotiators making the decisions in the Climate Convention. And it's immense what the gaps still are there. And it's through things like games that those people really have a meaningful discussion, rather than just coming from their own corners and projecting their view of the world.
And maybe to take a step back and look at COP19 outcome, it was 19, wasn't it? Yeah, if you could tell us maybe, what do you think is important now? What are the important next steps to take what has been agreed on there, which a lot of people have criticized as not enough? So how do we turn this around? What do you think are the next milestones? And to our community in particular, what do they need to do right now?
Well, we always knew that Warsaw was going to be a stepping stone for a process that would only culminate in 2015 in Paris, when we have the next big climate summit, such as Copenhagen the previous time. So expectations weren't too high. And even those not too high expectations maybe weren't fully met. But it's better than complete standstill. At least we're making another small step. Countries committed to telling the world how much they were going to commit to reducing greenhouse gas emissions before we have that summit in 2015. We established some mechanism on dealing with loss and damage from climate change, which particularly the most affected countries felt very strongly about. So there are some small steps forward. At the same time, it's particularly the pace, the very small steps forward every year that we have another of these immense negotiating rounds that worry me. We're not addressing the problems fast enough compared to the scale of the issues that we're facing.
And what do you think is important to do now, especially for the aid community that is watching this and wants to have an impact?
It's primarily about raising awareness. This is not an issue that we can just leave to politicians to solve at the global level. This is a discussion that we need to have everywhere and build the common momentum to come up with solutions that aren't just a solution for the climate change problem, but are actually addressing many issues at once. And I think it's central to the development challenge over the coming few years.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. We'll be watching this closely.
Pleasure. Thank you.
That was great. My pleasure.